considering the kind of market conditions that we're dealing with. How did you get this deal done, and why now?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the credit goes to my bankers at Credit Suisse, so David Hermer, Niran Stabinsky. I decided to file for two SPACs in a row, IPO-B and IPO-C, on the heels of the success of my first one, IPO-A, which where we merged with Virgin Galactic. And, the story there, the stock is still up almost, 70, 80% from where we closed the transaction in October. But, we launched that deal a month ago, literally on the worst day that the market has ever seen in the history of the stock market. So, we kind of whiffed the first time around, and we decided to put a pin in it, take a step back, let the markets recover and regain some composure. And, the last couple of weeks, as I said to you when I spoke, it seemed like there was a little bit more solid footing. And so we decided to come out yesterday, and it was extremely well received, obviously. We upsized the deal 20% late yesterday, and now we start trading. And now the real job begins, which is to find an indelible, interesting technology company for us to merge with or buy.
Tell me about that. How is that search going to go? From what I understand, you're going to be looking primarily outside the United States. And are we talking the same sort of time frame of a year that we've talked about SPACs in the past? Is that generally what we're looking towards?
Well, so, I think about what happened with Virgin, right? So that deal and the performance of that deal, so the return to investors has been beyond exceptional. And the reason is because we were both patient and we had the wherewithal to look globally. And ultimately, though, we found a deal in our backyard, essentially, in Southern California. This time around, we think the same market conditions apply, so we need to be patient. So we have up to 2 years to deploy the capital. But what I would tell you is I think that in terms of dislocations, the private markets relative to the public markets are in a really bad situation. And I think prices are off anywhere from 30 to 50%. And in the United States, those prices will probably recover a little bit faster. In Europe and in China, I think it's going to be a little bit more problematic, to be quite honest with you. And so a lot of the intention of IPO-C is around where I think the most value exists, and for us to find an incredible opportunity for investors to do well. Now, it won't mean that it'll exclusively be a deal that's in Europe or in China. It may very well be another company in the US, but for right now, I'm going to take a global approach. There are about 450 technology unicorns that exist. All of them need capital, some more than others, and some more in dire straits than others. And in all of these things, my team and I are going to try to find a great way to get something very good done for them, but also for us.
Would you have been on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange today, Chamath, had it been open? And just talk to me about the simple process of doing this at a time when we're all going through this stay-at-home and work-from-home scenario that we've fallen into.
I mean, to be honest, it was very a touch-and-go process. It was deftly handled by my bankers at CS. But what I would tell you is, a lot of it was done via Zoom and via phone calls. My IPO roadshow was done that way. Our testing the waters meetings were done that way. Our bring down and pricing meeting was purely on the phone. So these are things that I didn't do before. Before, these are all in-person things, because you're talking about, myself and investors investing hundreds of millions of dollars in something. So it was a new process. But I think what it means, and you and I have talked about this before, is if I can raise $720 million via video conference and launch a public company on the New York Stock Exchange in the middle of a pandemic, I think what it means is that most work can happen remotely. And to that, I think that there are a lot of broad-based social implications that are really interesting and probably worthwhile.
Yeah, it's interesting. And we'll continue to follow this deal for certain. I do at this point, though, want to revisit the comments that you made with me a couple of weeks ago, comments that, at least on Twitter, went viral. We mentioned more than 10 million views. I think we're up to 10.5 million right now. I'd like to rewatch part of that exchange, Chamath, and then I want to react to it on the other side.
Sure.
Just, you keep saying propping up zombie companies. Are you arguing to let airlines, for example, fail?
Yes.
Why? I mean, How does that make sense in the broader scheme of the economy?
Because it's not, because when you look at what it means, this is why I'm saying, like, this is a lie that's been purported by Wall Street. When a company fails, it does not fire their employees. It goes through a packaged bankruptcy, right? If anything, what happens is the people who have the pensions inside those companies, the employees of these companies, end up owning more of the company. The people that get wiped out are the speculators that own the unsecured tranches of debt or the folks that own the equity. And by the way, those are the rules of the game. That's right, because these are the people that purport to be the most sophisticated investors in the world. They deserve to get wiped out. But the employees don't get wiped out. The pensions don't typically get wiped out.
Why does anybody, I just don't understand, why does
people.
anybody deserve, using your word, to get wiped out from a crisis created like this? How does anybody deserve to get wiped out?
Well, but just be clear, like, who are we talking about? We're talking about a hedge fund that serves a bunch of billionaire family offices? Who cares? Let them get wiped out. Who cares? They don't get to summer in the Hamptons? Who cares?
All right, so that was a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot in there, and I want to go through some of it. But you use, statements like the lie purported by Wall Street. You talk about the speculators, and you go after hedge funds. But here you are, Chamath, on a day where you're doing an IPO at the New York Stock Exchange, raising hundreds of millions of dollars, essentially selling this IPO and marketing it to the very speculators that you rail against. And I'm wondering how you can square that on a day like today, and this is the perfect day to have that conversation.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that's not true. There are all kinds of different kinds of hedge funds and investment vehicles. And what I will tell you is that a lot of my time in IPO-A and again in IPO-C was curating the list of investors that, I would work with. And when I look at the list of people that I essentially allowed into the deal at the amounts that they did, these are because these are folks that have proven to be long-dated, thoughtful people who can take risks but understand businesses. Look, let's shift the topic for 1 second and we can come back to this. What I want to talk about is why I made the comments that I did and why it touched such a nerve. There's an interesting fact, Scott, that you should know, which is that since 2009, the 500 companies in the S&P 500, so these are the 500 best companies in the world, they bought back $7 trillion of stock and or issued dividends. Okay, that turned out to be more than 90 cents of every single dollar of profit that they made over the last 11 plus years. The federal government, as well as the Fed, between monetary and fiscal stimulus combined, have essentially transferred around $7 trillion now back to those said companies, as well as companies slightly smaller than them. And I think why I was frustrated is that I just think that kind of behavior makes no sense. And instead of being punished, it has been rewarded. And if you ask me why, here's how I would explain it. The job of a CEO, especially of a public for-profit company, is to be a fabulous allocator of resources. And there are only two kinds of resources that a CEO controls that matter. The first is human capital, right? The people that work inside of your company and the ideas that they have and the products that they make. And the second is financial capital, the money that you take to invest in great ideas, to protect for the future, to prepare for whether it's a pandemic or a shock or a recession or a competitor. And the best capital allocators become the best CEOs. So if you take a company like Facebook or Google, they're a very capital asset-light business. So a lot of their skill is in picking great people. So take Zuck. He picked Sheryl Sandberg. He picked me. He put us in positions to build that business. He's a fabulous human capital allocator. On the other end of the spectrum, take Buffett. He has no human capital inside of Berkshire. It's all financial capital, but he is a fabulous capital allocator. Or you take Jeff Bezos, a case in the middle, where he has both of those two things. In all cases, great CEOs are great allocators of capital. When you do things like buybacks and dividends, what you are essentially saying is you are throwing your hands up in the air and declaring to the world, I do not know what to do with this money. And instead of deciding to save that money, to try to do M&A, to try to invest in R&D, to pay your employees more, these people have given it back in an open market purchase. Now, let's look at that for a second. Why is that a stupid idea? Well, it's a stupid idea for two reasons. The first is that it disproportionately only benefits the executives and the CEO and the board, because those are the ones that disproportionately get most of the stock inside of a company. And it disproportionately benefits those specific hedge funds that were agitating for that behavior and activity, who take a short-term position and allow themselves to participate in short-term profits. And now what happens is the people that believe least in the company, i.e. the people that sell the stock, get rewarded. And then who's left holding the bag? The people that believe in the business. Let's take a specific example, Scott, and you can see how bad this is. IBM, over the last decade, has spent $140 billion on buybacks. This is a company with a $100 billion market cap. The last CEO found a way to oversee 24 consecutive quarters of revenue decline, and for that, was still able to compensate herself $100 million of stock-based comp. Now, you look at all of this kind of behavior and you can say, how is this supported? Why aren't all these companies trying to figure out how to be more resilient? And it turns out that the incentives were so skewed away from being resilient, it was only focused on short-term profiteering for the sake of the managerial class and the hedge funds around them, and nobody else.
IBM is a, you could say, a convenient example for you to use. Yes, they've bought back a lot of stock. The stock performance over the last many years has not been good. The business performance hasn't necessarily been good either. I take your point on that. However, I could easily come back to you and say, so what do you say about a company like Apple, Chamath? Are you saying that Tim Cook is not a good steward of that company? They've bought back arguably more stock than anybody else. That was at one point the most valuable company on earth. A lot of people beyond Apple shareholders or Apple employees have been rewarded as a result of that. Every Apple shareholder and people who have stayed with that company for a long period of time have been rewarded. The company still has a hoard of cash that it is sitting on. So what's the difference?
You just proved my point. So let's assume you had a kid, two kids. One kid was called IBM and the other kid was called Apple. One kid, every time they made a buck, spent a buck. The other kid saved most of that dollar and every now and then spent 10 or 20 cents. And then all of a sudden something happens and the first kid starts to ask you for help. And the second kid is just sitting around thinking, well, I saved for a rainy day. That is the difference between IBM and Apple. And that is exactly why I think Tim Cook in many ways has done a good job, because he has kept so much cash always available to do a deal. Warren Buffett is another great example. You only do these things when the stock is low, when it's below some sort of intrinsic value, and when the incremental cash is just absolutely not necessary. You don't do it with the primary oxygen that you need to survive. And that's what most of these companies have done. And that's why this whole issue is just one of these things that really upsets people, because when you work inside of a business and you yourself are giving them your entire life, you're giving them your most valuable asset, which is your time, you expect, and you should expect, that the CEO and the board are exercising good judgment. And in my opinion, buybacks are the primary example of a growing strain of incompetence amongst CEOs and amongst boards. And it's where we need to start thinking about how the rules need to change so that average shareholders, retail investors, the stakeholders of these companies benefit more.
I'm just suggesting
that— And in times like this, hold on, Scott, and in times like this is where it gets exposed. So for example, instead of, the argument against this, by the way, that people always make is, well, the capital markets are efficient, and so when we do share buybacks, we allocate the capital more efficiently into other things. And what I would tell you in rebuttal is it's clearly not true. In a moment where we needed an economy to be resilient, what we have are people making masks out of socks and underwear, our primary healthcare workers forced to use rain ponchos to protect themselves, and people instead who actually were able to profiteer from the last 10 years of low interest rates and debt-based buybacks, buying beachfront condos and art and apartments in New York City. It's totally broken.
All I'm suggesting is that all buybacks aren't necessarily created equal. I take your point well, and a lot of people agree with you, but a blanket statement about all buybacks, I think, can be flawed if you use examples like Apple, which you yourself admit was not a bad example of a company buying back a lot of stock, rewarding its shareholders and stakeholders at the same time.
So let's just be more nuanced. So number one, if it were up to me, what I would tell you is that open market purchases of stock by companies should be banned. It was banned before, it should be banned again. These things should be done via tender offers. Number two, it should be done when you can demonstrably prove that you don't need the money for other things, or you shouldn't have the money for other things, meaning a rainy day fund or an R&D, line item or something else. There's only a third, by the way, a third of companies in the S&P 500 that even spend on research and development. I mean, haven't we realized in a moment like this that we actually need to rebuild so much of the infrastructure of the United States, that it is decrepit and it has been left to basically decay and die in the hands of profiteers?
Absolutely.
Haven't we realized that we should be putting more money in these things?
Mark Andreessen wrote an essay about it in the last several days about now is the time to build. Those were his words, and I think you agreed with what he said in the essay that he put out via Twitter. So your point is well taken. I mean, it's undeniable. It's undeniable that there have been companies that have wasted away money on buybacks and other things that would be better served used right now at a time of ultimate crisis. I totally get your point. But look, I don't want to get off the original point that I had. I don't feel as though I got a good answer to that. You've gone to the public markets today in a system that you have railed against at times. Who do you think is buying your deal today? It's institutions and it's hedge funds. Are you saying that you went through the prospectus of the investors and wouldn't let any hedge funds get in on the deal?
Yep. Let me be very clear. I picked and approved every single line item before we closed the pricing of the deal. Now, when it trades in the secondary market, can I tell you who owns the stock? No, I don't know. We will find out above certain thresholds. But let me be clear, when we priced this deal, I picked every single name.
Okay. Would you?
And that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to partner
sure.
with folks that are trustworthy and reliable and long dated. Now, it's not that the capital markets are entirely broken. And it takes people like me, and I think I have a responsibility to do good transactions and to do things that are valuable, that are not short term. Let me just go back to Virgin for a second. We are in an environment right now where we have decided to use space flight as a bridge, and we've talked about this publicly, to build a hypersonic airplane, right? Something that can go Los Angeles to Tokyo in 45 minutes. Imagine how valuable that is in a post-pandemic world. People don't want to sit 12 hours inside of a long-haul aircraft anymore. People don't want to be at the airport for 3 hours, waiting to go through security anymore. So these are things that are hard and that are needed to be built. And so am I proud that I did that transaction? Yes. Do I wish that I had tens or hundreds of billions of dollars so I could do all of these things by myself? Yes, but I don't. And so I need partners. And there are some good partners that exist in the world, and the capital markets are efficient in helping me find them. But equally as they are efficient, they are inefficient in other ways. And in those ways, there are ways that the rules can be changed to make things more reasonable so that when things that are exogenous or externalities happen, we are all as a society not left holding the bag. And that's what we are doing right now.
The other point, frankly, is that had the Fed and the government not stepped in the manner in which they did, you probably wouldn't have been able to get your deal done at all right now because of the stability that it brought to the markets. You mentioned it earlier, that the markets are more calm now. How would you have gotten this deal done?
That's not true. Scott, that's not true. The thing that I want to keep in mind is that, a lot of the money that the Fed put in, those consequences, many of which will be unintended, will only be visible in the medium and long term. They are not going to be visible now. the thing that the Fed did well before this crisis, which was a necessary ability for the capital markets to function, was how they stepped into the repo markets, and then maybe you could claim the commercial paper market. And I appreciate that help, but that was broad-based support that was, in many ways a warning sign that there was something structurally wrong with the amount of leverage that the whole industry was using and other things. That was not a pandemic-related thing. And so, that's a job that the Fed has to do, and they did well. But, buying, billions and billions of dollars of, junk debt, I'm not sure what the long-term impacts of that are. I don't think it has an effect on, good companies running their business. And I don't know what the consequences of that will be. Back to the stimulus to begin with, one thing that we talked about the last time, which I would like to bring up again, is we just went back to the well again, another $450-odd billion. Mm-hmm. And again, I would just make, a claim to, to the extent any sort of, folks are listening that can implement this, is that we really need to think about more direct payments to people. And the reason is because, Scott, when you decompose GDP, 70% of GDP is all consumer spending, meaning the United States has this incredible ability for consumers to always lead the way, and they drive all recoveries. It's not businesses and it's not government spending. And so, the one way that we have tried to get money to consumers is by giving it to companies in the hopes that it trickles through those companies back to employees. And what I will tell you is I think we will be disappointed by that. I think that a lot of companies that got support will still be struggling when the terms of those grants and loans fall off, which is September. And unfortunately, I think we may see large waves of layoffs that just happen in Q4 heading into Christmas time of 2020. Instead, I think we really need to think about direct capital injections into the hands of people. And when you look at the governments all around the world, they've all embraced this, particularly in the developing world. And I would just encourage us, there's maybe not that many lessons you could claim to be learned from a developing country, but this is one where I think that their level of compassion for everyday citizens in their countries is worth copying.
Well, we
and
certainly
putting
need
more money into people's hands, letting consumer spending drive GDP as we try to get out of this pandemic, I think is a very good and smart idea.
We certainly need a more efficient way to get the money to the people who actually need it. It's one of the reasons why Harvard's acceptance of money through the CARES Act, not necessarily the PPP program, caused some level of outrage, including from you. I mean, that's a sign
when people
when people are sitting there.
It's a complete joke, and it's a perversion of what this program is supposed to be. And this is what I mean by it'll take a while, Scott, for us to really figure out the unintended consequences of this. If there are multimillionaire land developers that are getting PPP, but not small businesses that really employ one or two people, or, that they work with banks that don't have the connectivity into the government, whereas the large banks were able to facilitate and mobilize credit or payments to their best businesses. All of these things are probably what happened. Back to your first point, I just want to make sure that I touch this. The IRS knows how to give money to every single citizen taxpayer of the United States. They know this. They know how to do it tomorrow. They could cut a check tomorrow. It'll be the least complicated thing we've ever done because we've done it for for hundreds of years via the IRS.
Look, there are others who have suggested, like, Gary Cohn, for example, during the town hall we did, that if you would have had the payroll processors who know everybody, they know everybody who is at least getting a paycheck, and then we can do other methods to more efficiently find out who needs money as well, who's not through the payroll system. Get the money to them immediately.
Here's another example. Look, we're going to spend trillions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money on junk debt. There's $1 trillion of U.S. student debt that sits at the Department of Education. There's nothing stopping the Federal Reserve from retiring that debt. Massively simple, straightforward, easy way to drive consumer spending, to give money into the hands of consumers, to do something right for individual U.S. citizens and taxpayers. That's another idea. My point is, right now we are way too tilted into things that are opaque, that are difficult to administer, and that may not have the intended consequences we want. Of every dollar that we've given out, fiscal and monetary, what we're talking about is less than 5 cents that has gotten into the hands of a U.S. consumer. All I'm saying is, why not 10 or 15 cents or 20 cents? And keep most of the other programs as they are? Or why not the incremental spending going towards student debt or towards direct payments to U.S. taxpayers? These are not bad ideas. And in a moment like this, when we've already done it once and we've already ripped the philosophical Band-Aid off, there's nothing stopping us from, instead of saying, here's 2 weeks, to say, here's 2 months, or here's, 6 weeks. We are that compassionate, and we can be that compassionate. And I don't understand instead why we continue to defend practices that were not justifiable at any point in time, but particularly in a moment like this, where we can see that an entire U.S. economy was completely unprepared for any form of externality or exogenous shock.
I would hope that we're all on the same page here in terms of believing the things that you're saying about people who need money and need it now in the most efficient way possible. I'd like to believe that we're all on that same page. I want to get back to something else regarding this conversation and discussion, debate, however you want to characterize it on bailouts. You mentioned Galactic earlier. Richard Branson is essentially asking the British government for a bailout of some $620 million. He's the 7th richest person, by the way, in the United Kingdom. Should he get a bailout?
It's up to the UK government. It's not up to me. This has nothing to do with Virgin Galactic.
No, of course it doesn't have anything to do with Virgin Galactic, but you do business with Mr. Branson. If you're against bailouts here, what's the difference? He's asking for taxpayer money. Should he get a bailout?
Right. So as a U.S. citizen, I've told you what the U.S. should do. I cannot decide what the UK government should do. Whatever Bojo wants to do, he has proven he will do. And I think Richard has a claim to make, just like all the U.S. airlines had a claim to make. And then I think the government needs to decide. If you want me to tell you what I would do in the United States, like I said, people get confused by the difference between liquidation and insolvency. In Australia, what Richard did is now he is going through a process of insolvency and bankruptcy protection. And I think that these are historically been thought of as bad words, but they're not. These are the safest ways in many ways to preserve employees, to preserve their jobs, and to preserve pensions. So I would applaud him for doing the right things. And if he does get aid, he'll do the right thing. He's an honorable, good person.
Oh, I'm not suggesting he's not. I just want to have a conversation on, if some bailouts are bad and others are good. We're talking about airlines, which we discussed last time. Who should get a bailout?
It all depends,
and who
Scott,
and who
it
shouldn't?
all depends on the terms. In the United States, here's what I know for sure. I don't know the terms of what's happening in the UK or anywhere else. But in the United States, 30 cents of all of these dollars became grants that are essentially tied to a fig leaf, which is that you're not going to fire folks until September 30th. Now, if I was a betting man, which I am, it just means that it just stalls the inevitable into Q4. And so you're going to have to ask yourself, when the money gets spent and the people still get let go, what did we accomplish? What did we accomplish?
You
and
talked
the reason
about...
the people, Scott, hold on. And the reason the people will let go is it didn't fundamentally change the capital structure of these companies. And unless you change the capital structure of these companies, there are too many people who have a claim to the planes, to the revenue streams, to coupon payments. And unless we're going to basically put a pin in sort of business law in the United States, those folks will dictate how these airlines will act. This is why I said, before we start to give a lot of money, what we should probably do is take a step back and first clean up the capital structure of some of these businesses.
Sure, but you also suggested, though, Chamath, that bankruptcy itself was perhaps a much prettier process than it actually is. I just want to read your comments. We can discuss this further as well. When a company fails, it does not fire their employees. It goes through a packaged bankruptcy, right? If anything, what happens is the people who have the pensions inside those companies, the employees of these companies, end up owning more of the company. The people that get wiped out are the speculators that own the unsecured tranches of debt, or the folks that own the equity. That statement, though, it does not fire their employees. Bankruptcy is not necessarily as pretty as that paints it out to be. Companies who go through a restructuring, maybe they come back smaller, they don't have as many employees, their finances aren't nearly as good as they were pre-bankruptcy. Isn't that fair?
I think their finances are generally cleaner post-bankruptcy. And again, there's a very big difference between going through, a restructuring process and a prepackaged bankruptcy process and what otherwise could be a very destructive process, which is a liquidation. Those are two very different things.
Sure,
Scott,
but not every bankruptcy results in employees keeping their job, Chamath.
I don't disagree with that, but what I will tell you is that you can minimize the amount of damage that's done. So, for example, I think I read somewhere, and somebody I'm sure on Twitter will figure out the exact number, but when Delta went through a bankruptcy in 2012, I believe, they only shed 150 odd jobs. They had 55,000 employees, and now they're at 90,000 employees. So there are ways to do this thoughtfully in a humane way. What I will tell you is, in the absence of a restructuring of the capital structure of many of these businesses that have taken money, the bondholders will show up at the front door. There will be forced liquidations. There will be forced, very, very complicated bankruptcies. And in that, there will be lots of preventable damage. And so what I think should have happened instead is, before giving them a short-term loan, is to require them to clean up the capital structure so that the employees and the pensions and things would be safe. I think, unfortunately, because that hasn't happened, many companies will exhaust the lifeline the government has given them, still go through a lot of trouble in getting back to 100%, and then unfortunately will have to still let a lot of people go. And again, then they'll just push the restructuring event to further in the future. And I just think you're better off taking this medicine now and not later, because the damage will be worse.
I want to ask you sort of generally, we're 2 weeks, from your prior appearance. The market's done a fair amount since then. Does this make sense to you, where the market is currently trading relative to the multitude of issues that you raise regarding what Main Street is going through? Here you are, having done an IPO today, taking advantage of a more calm market, but not necessarily a more sane one.
You're absolutely right. I don't understand particularly what's going on, and I think right now Wall Street is entirely divorced from Main Street. There is no the stock market, in my opinion, and the bond market should reflect the actual state of affairs on the ground, and right now it doesn't. And so, from my perspective, here's what I see. What I see is delinquencies of all kinds of loan payments, cars, homes, general business obligations ticking up, which means people are less and less able or capable of paying. I see, hundreds of thousands, millions of people getting furloughed. I see us approaching 20 to 25% unemployment. And I essentially see the stock market, largely because of the practices of the Fed, completely ignoring the logic of what's actually happening. Now, if the stock markets were down, what actually would happen is our government officials would probably be more prone to act, and particularly around the things that could directly help individuals and consumers. But right now, we're in this world where we believe that as the stock market performs, everything is okay, and it's just not true. And so, when you take a step back and look at the disease, because at the end of this all comes back to what we know about COVID-19 and this pandemic. And the reality is, we don't know any more than we knew in January. And increasingly, we're getting more questions, not fewer questions. So when we thought that remdesivir would work, now we don't know as much. When we thought hydrochloroquine and azithromycin would work, now we're not sure anymore. Before, we thought that all you could do is get the disease when you're young and everything was okay. And now there's some early data that says you could actually be diminishing your long-term life expectancy even if you do recover. All of these things create enormous questions to me, not answers. And in that, I think the economy can do only sort of fits and starts. It's not able to really get to the start line. And so state by state, county by county, you're going to see chaos. So look at Georgia. In Georgia, the governor said, let's get back to work. Everything's going to be great. Open the bars, open this, open that. And then the mayor said, no, we don't want you guys to go out. So even when county health officials and the mayors and the governor of the state can't get on the same page, and then they and the federal government necessarily can't get on the same page, it sets up for a very confusing moment in time. And what I would tell you is that an impact today is not something that's a 1 or 2 week recovery period. An impact today is a meaningful injury that needs to be rehabilitated over months, if not years. And so the longer we're in this sort of chaotic back and forth process once shelter in place is officially lifted, I suspect that we are in a stop and go motion probably until Q3 of next year. And I think in that there is more damage that's going to be done. This is why I'm so sensitive to, and I'm just imploring folks to really think about direct payments and ways in which we can drive consumer solvency, and really think about the middle class and the folks that build up the base of the United States economy, most of the workers in the U.S. And we're just not doing enough.
Well, I know
and
that, and
they
that's one
are
of
the lifeblood of who needs to lead us out.
No question. You talk about what George is doing. We hope it goes well. We need people and want people to be able to go back to work. We just want them to do it. I think in the safest way possible.
Yep, I understand that. So do I. But hope is not a strategy. I hope to be able to dunk on Draymond Green. It's not going to happen. Like these are things that you want to have happen, but they're not rooted in fact.
But then should Georgia go ahead with its reopen because people need to go back to work, and we'll just see what happens?
Well, I think what we're going through right now is a grand experiment. The shoulda, coulda, woulda doesn't matter. The point is that there is a governor that's going to, make a decision, and then there are individual mayors and county health officials that are either going to toe the line and agree with that, or they're going to go in the opposite direction. And then individual citizens will unfortunately be put to the test. And this is why I think that a lot of people, in the absence of support, will have to optimize to earn money and to make money to pay their bills. And it may unnecessarily put them in harm's way. And because we don't know much more than we knew in January, this is why we have to give them the ability to think about their own long-term health above anything else. And unfortunately, we're not going to do that. So tens of millions of U.S. workers are unfortunately going to basically say, well, I need to make money. I hope I don't get sick. And I hope it doesn't, shorten my life expectancy. But what can I do? I need to pay the rent. And that's a tragic thing that the greatest country in the world should be putting people in.
I think a lot of people would agree with you. Chamath, we appreciate it as always. You be well, and we'll talk to you again soon, I know.